Chapter 35, Act 35, The Lightbringer's Tale. Act 35, The Lightbringer's Tale. The Devoted. What little color Cecil had left drained from his features as his eyes followed the path of Golbez's fall, a delicate nebula of moon dust and crystal slivers rising in the air as his elder brother's body crashed into the ground. A stream of unbidden tears ran down his cheeks, stinging the lacerations he had incurred from the night's darkness attack. The Dark Knight stepped forward, crushing his boot into Golbez's bare stomach and twisting his palm so that Cecil, still under his control, was forced to turn his head and witness Golbez's final humiliation. The Dark Knight then bent down, digging his heel in fiercely as he hissed in Golbez's ear.
"Forgive you, you say? You dare to believe this atones for throwing me aside?"
The fallen sorcerer's body went slack under the crushing weight of the Dark Knight. Golbez's dark silver hair had spilled behind him like a trailing moonlit river, and the peaceful, near smile he wore on his lips made it look as if he was merely sleeping, back in stasis, dreaming of the future promised to him millennia ago like any other normal Lunarian. The hilt of the knife glinted dangerously from the folds of his cloak, and a fresh, delicate trail of ruby-red blood had shed over the grooves of his abdominals, staining the crystal tile beneath with the steadiness of a ticking clock. Drip. 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 Theodore, Rosa, and Kane were frozen in place behind Cecil, their throats raw from screaming and their clouded minds still in shock from what had just occurred. The Dark Knight, not paying them nor Cecil any mind, still wasn't finished dispensing his justice. Spitting disgustedly in the sorcerer's face, he yanked his foot away from Golbez's stomach and proceeded to mercilessly implant it between his ribs with a series of frenzied kicks.
"Isn't this what you wanted this entire time? To die at the hands of the brother you abandoned?" Stop it!"
Rosa suddenly shrieked, throwing herself over Golbez's body just as another fierce kick knocked him over on his side. She wrapped her arms around Golbez's shoulders, clutching him to her chest and letting out a strangled sob.
"He's gone. Haven't you done enough?"
The Dark Knight stumbled backward in shock to keep his foot from flying into her face.
Why? Why do you choose him, Rosa? This man threw me away like trash when I was a child. He steered the world to its own destruction."
She shook her head, glaring at her husband's doppelganger with such raw hatred that Theodore was overtaken with tremors.
"You are not my Cecil."
The Dark Knight's eyes widened, a flash of hurt briefly illuminating the swirling darkness. But it passed quickly, and he retaliated by lifting his other hand, bidding his knife to return to his side. Rosa flinched as the weapon tore itself cleanly away from Golbez and went sailing in a straight line back into the knight's waiting fingers.
"I've no need for traitors, either. If you love that bastard so much, you can go on and die alongside him." "Mother!"
Theodore screamed, and before Kane could reach out and stop him, launched himself at the Dark Knight's knees and tackled him to the ground, sending the knife spinning several feet away across the floor. Theodore scrambled to pin the knight beneath his thighs, clumsily reaching for Excalibur and feeling his fingers, slick with sweat, slip every time he caught a glance at the Dark Knight's, no, his father's, threatening glare. After a few terse moments of struggle, the Dark Knight finally gained back the upper hand, slamming a palm full of bubbling, smoking, dark magic in Theodore's face. Theodore clawed at his burning eyes and wailed pathetically, the taste of acid and rotting flesh filling his nose and mouth as he choked on an attempted Asuna spell. The Dark Knight took advantage of the distraction, yanking one leg free from Theodore and violently smashing it into the boy's chest, sending him flying backward into Rosa and Golbez. The three of them crashed together in a tangled heap, Theodore's weeping, scourge-ridden eyes spinning in their sockets as the back of his head struck something hard, dousing everything in black. Mount Ordeals. Scarmiglione. Terrified? Porum didn't have much time to ponder Leonora's unexpected proclamation. The earthen fiend made a gruesome retching sound that she knew meant she needed to exit his splash zone post-haste. Snatching Leonora's arm, Porum dove out of the way, palm dodge rolling to the left. Seconds later, a stream of bile and blood came hurling out of Scarmiglione's slash of a mouth, dissolving the rocky floor where the three of them had been crouching only moments before and giving rise to a burst of foggy, noxious vapors. Leonora shrieked as she watched the earth liquefy before her eyes, the toxic concoction sinking into the cracks of the surrounding land and starting to eat away at it inch by inch.
"If we don't hurry, he'll destroy the entire summit," she gasped. "There's going to be nowhere left for us to run." "Porum.
Palom cried from across the widening chasm, swinging his rod like a bat at the pustule of filth Scarmaglione had launched at him and watching as it exploded in midair, bombarding them all with a new wave of hellish stink that made the three mages desperately rush to cover their faces. From behind his hand, Palom finished his muffled thought,
"We've got a twin cast." "Alright."
Porum blanched, feeling as if the star ring on her finger had suddenly shrunk 5 sizes. She could feel the band constricting around her flesh as every cell in her body became aware of the very real possibility that maybe she and Palom couldn't even cast such magic together anymore. They had practiced their craft of twin casting relentlessly as children. Enough residents of Mysidia would tell you with pride that the two of them had invented it long before the concept of a band ever entered the layperson lexicon. But just having a relic to transmit the magic, the rings, wasn't enough. A relic could merely transform the power that had already been gathered to greater heights, the deepest of bonds, and a total synchronicity between two souls had to be present first and foremost. And I now understand that it is not blood that makes a bond. Porum frowned. She thought of the elder, who had been her father in all but name, and Cecil, who had been like a surrogate older brother to her and Palom since the day fate swept him into their lives. But Palom. So much pain and misunderstanding had eaten away at their friendship in the last 10 years, even though it seemed to her that they were stumbling toward forgiveness. Porum wasn't foolish enough to believe that the bad blood between them had been magically absolved just yet. Her heart racing, she tried to catch Palom's gaze as Scarmaglione raged on, the fiend alternating between violently expelling his sickness all over the now rapidly disintegrating shrine and flinging broken rock, transformed into poison darts by the touch of his hand. She was in such a stunned state that she hadn't even realized Leonora was fervently bathing them in defensive magic to give them a fighting chance at surviving whatever Scarmaglione's next assault would be.
Porom.
Palom's shriek stirred her from her self-induced mental flogging, and she jumped back in surprise as a massive crystal shard, dripping in putrid acid, came flying directly for her face. With a flash of blinding gold light, the shard smashed into a protect spell Leonora had cast, shattering on the ground at Porum's feet instead of being implanted in her forehead.
"Are you okay?"
Leonora huffed, and Porum bit her lip.
"Yes. Thank you."
Urgh. Scarmaglione groaned, pausing in place as his bloodied claws tore at what little flesh was left on his head, another spray of pus and oily acid splashing on the ground.
"Please. Before my very soul is crushed."
This might be our only chance. Porum clenched her jaw. So why? Why can't I? This is just like when I was here before with Enja and Megan and I couldn't cast Holy.
"Lady Porum."
Leonora grabbed Porum's hand, biting her lip as the girl stared down dully into Leonora's eyes. Her face had gone white as a sheet, and her hands were blocks of ice.
"Please. Palom needs you."
Porum gulped, a bead of sweat trailing down her temple.
"What if I can't? Are you afraid?"
Leonora asked softly, her gaze searching Porum's with nary a trace of judgment. The Epopt had certainly sensed the strain between the twins even before she had been able to witness their dynamic when they were trapped in the tower together, and it wasn't as if Palom had not been very subtle about his current relationship with his sister when it had just been the two of them in Troya. But when they had been transported to Mount Ordeals, she thought perhaps things were getting better. She had felt the tiniest shift in their demeanor toward each other even as they bickered per usual.
"I don't know,"
Porum moaned, closing her eyes.
"Maybe. Yes. Definitely."
If I can no longer twin cast with Palom, what does that say about any chances of us really reconciling? If we do make it back home, will things just go back to being the same as always, without the threat of a crisis breathing down our necks? Leonora chewed her lip thoughtfully. She had never been much of a counselor, in fact, she was usually the one being counseled. So, she decided to tear a page out of the book from the last time she had gotten advice on such a subject, realizing that the person who had imparted it upon her had now become certainly as precious to her as he was to his sister.
"Just close your eyes,"
Leonora instructed, and to her surprise, Porum complied, clenching them tightly shut while still clinging to Leonora's hand.
"Now. Just do whatever comes naturally to your body. Give in to instinct. Pour yourself into the one who holds your soul, whose soul, in turn, you hold as well." "Palom,"
Porum murmured, a faint holy aura starting to glow over the surface of her skin. Leonora stepped back quietly, releasing Porum's hand and turning toward Palom, who had fallen into a trance as well, glowing with his own midnight-stained aura. "I'll protect you both," Leonora swore, her eyes going back to Scarmaglione. She could feel the suffocating mix of hatred and terror rolling off of him in waves, her throat clenching at just the thought of breathing in any more of his toxicity. The fiend was writhing in an almost vulgar fashion on the crushed remains of the shrine, Leonora cringing as she watched him needlessly tear chunks of hair out of his leathery, battered flesh, all the while letting out a wail that she had no doubt was being carried across the moon. In a sudden fit, he flung out his gnarled claws, shooting dual bio spells at the oblivious and entranced twins.
"Our reflect!"
Leonora cried, a curtain of rainbow light embracing the twins with just seconds to spare before the bio spells collided into the two of them, bouncing off the reflect spell and speeding back towards Scarmaglione. With a terrific crash and a cringe-inducing sizzle, the gloppy green slime of the spell drenched the fiend, sending him into a fit of delirious laughter as a blackened tongue snaked out of his mouth and licked the bottom half of his jaw clean. With gleaming eyes, he turned toward Leonora, launching himself with his hind legs and pinning her to the ground beneath his rotting husk of a body.
"Ahhhhhhh!"
She screamed, gagging uncontrollably as his offending stink invaded her nose and mouth, filling her lungs with a throbbing burn that felt as if she had been lit aflame. Squirming as the remains of the bio spell dripped over her face and left in its wake a trail of acid-tinged flesh, Leonora struggled to roll herself onto her side, her legs flailing as her ballet slippers merely sank into pockets of squishy, atrophied muscle that hung listlessly from Scarmaglione's frame. She glared up into the dead hollows that were his eyes, and felt her body seize in place, the urge to fight suddenly abandoning her. His fear is even stronger. There's something in his mind that is torturing him. It's almost as if he holds no control over his body. What is your connection to the crystal of Earth? Why did I feel the same fearsome despair from our crystal that I can now sense within you? Wondering if she was about to make the most foolish move of her life, Leonora closed her eyes, holding her breath to minimize the amount of contamination she had to inhale as she conjured her spell. Just when she thought her lungs could bear her efforts no longer, her hands shot up to Scarmaglione's face, clutching it closer to hers as she exhaled a painful rush of air, the spell uttered under her breath.
"Isuna!"
Shimmering white light sprinkled over the fiend like a self-contained springtime storm, dancing on the raised hairs on his flesh and sinking into the hollow cavities of his exposed skeleton. A flash of cognizance flickered in his eyes, and he peered down at Leonora's face, twisted with fright as her hands continued to shakily cling to his face. The black tongue slithered back into his mouth, a half-smirk lined with broken teeth illuminating his features.
"Thank you. I am one of the spirits of the land. Or at least I was. Once. I sense inside you what I once held inside me. A most sacred power. Spirits of the L-land."
Leonora stuttered, reluctantly lowering her hands. Scarmaglione nodded, his eyes lazily drifting upward as if he were stargazing. She couldn't help but follow his stare and was horrified to see a storm of meteors coming right for them, igniting themselves with dazzling red, blue, and purple flames. Palom and Porum's spell had been a success, and she was square in their crosshairs. But before Leonora could attempt to flee, she was startled to feel Scarmaglione throw his weight over hers once more, this time entirely covering her body with his own. Before his overpowering stench could register with her senses, she felt the relentless volley of meteors crash into him, cringing as a chorus of cracking bones and tearing flesh assaulted her ears. Although it felt like hours, the spell was spent in mere seconds. She hadn't realized she had squeezed her eyes shut until she felt a spill of sunlight pierce her eyelids. Palom and Porum had run to her side, twin looks of worry etched in their features as they hauled Scarmaglione's body off of her on the count of 3.
"Are you okay?"
Palom gasped, pulling Leonora against him before he could stop himself. Leonora's eyes slid open, stunned, and she found her hands involuntarily clutching to Palom's jacket as she gazed over her shoulder at the heap of rags that had become Scarmaglione's remains.
"We didn't know you were there,"
Porum wailed, her eyes wide.
"By the time we left our trance, it was too late." I'm fine,"
Leonora whispered, trying to catch her breath. Palom was squeezing the life out of her.
"Scarmaglione. He saved me." "What?"
Palom pulled back, eyeing Leonora warily.
"Are you sure you weren't having some sort of hallucination from his gas?" "I'm positive."
Leonora pouted, shoving Palom aside and crawling to Scarmaglione's corpse. He was already starting to melt into an oily pool of black, flecks of crystal dust gathering in the spill like a swirling galaxy. Biting her lip, Leonora reached for her mitre, pulling it from the pin in her hair and bowing her head deeply. Palom opened his mouth to call her back, but Porum shushed him before he could say anything, shaking her head. Leonora could feel it, something was shifting in the earth beneath her knees. A warmth was flooding through the barren mountain rock. A spirit was being released back into the universe. She whispered the prayer softly under her breath so that only he might hear.
For what it is worth, I thank you. May your next journey be one of peace.
A gentle voice echoed in her ear as she lifted from her bow. She would have hardly recognized it if it wasn't for the dreadful lisp.
Mass Sterling Golbez. I was hideous. And yet, you came for me. You alone. Cared not for my failures as a SSSage of the land. Hey.
Leonora gasped, holding her hand to her ear.
Wait.
Porum and Palom looked at each other, blinking. Who was she talking to? He's gone. Leonora sighed, settling back on her rear and watching as the swirling crystal shards gave birth to a new portal whose light spread over the remains of the now destroyed shrine to Cecil's father. She clutched the mitre to her chest, tears springing to her eyes. Scarmiglione called Golbez's name. I wonder if he knows what happened to this lost spirit? What twisted darkness could turn a gentle sage into something like this?
Blue planet to Leonora.
Palom exclaimed, and Leonora blinked, gazing up at the twins who were staring down at her bizarrely, like she had sprouted antennae or a third arm.
Who were you talking to?
Porum gently asked, and Leonora quickly shook her head.
Just myself. Maybe Palom was right, and I got a little woozy, breathing in all those nauseous fumes. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have been able to conjure the twin meteor spell.
Porum smiled, offering her hand. Leonora grabbed hold, allowing Porum to haul her to her feet and proceeding to brush all the filth from her robes.
It felt a little like déjà vu, hey.
Palom smirked.
This moon has a lot more going for it than meets the eye. Not only is it making us see these weird places, but now the crystals are bringing back our old enemies, too. Makes me excited to see what's next. Excited.
Leonora blanched.
I hope the enemy, whoever it may be, at least lets us catch our breath first. We'll have plenty of time to sleep when we're dead.
Palom shrugged, poking the toe of his boot into the portal.
Besides, we've still gotta find Edward and Harley, and make sure they haven't been eaten by Scarmiglione's zombie army. You're kidding.
Leonora gulped, and Porum sighed.
Yes, he is. I'm sure Edward and Harley, and all the others, are fine.
But the quiver in her voice gave away her true thoughts on that subject.
You fool.
Theodore's cheek twitched at the sound of the painfully familiar insult, the boy clenching his eyes shut tighter and rolling over in his bunk so that whoever was bothering him would get the hint to go away. Wait. My bunk. There came the march of pounding boots against wood, and the sound of a hand colliding with flesh. It took a few moments before Theodore realized what had happened, tears stinging in the corners of his eyes as he rolled onto his back and finally laid eyes on his visitor. At that moment, the shocked nerve endings in his cheek decided now was a good time to go into overdrive, and he felt the raging pain from the slap run up the side of his face like a river of fire. It took everything inside of him not to let out a blistering scream, as cathartic as that would have felt. Biggs was leaning over him, one eyebrow arched and his hand poised for strike two. Theodore immediately leapt out of the bunk, his eyes darting about frenziedly as he took in his surroundings. A small porthole that was filled with blue brilliance. Another tower of bunks across from his own, none of them occupied. The recognizable drone of a nearby engine room and the swooping propellers nearly muted by the deck above them. This is an airship? I'm home? So, everything that happened. Oh my gods. It was just a long nightmare. Biggs and Wedge. And all the others. They'd never. He quickly reached for his hip, his fingertips brushing over the familiar Baronian crest-imbued broadsword Cecil had given him before his trial had begun. Excalibur was gone. So, he must have dreamt of inheriting that, too.
Biggs!
Theodore began, but at that moment, Wedge appeared through the open doorway, rushing to Theodore's side and grasping the boy's shoulders. Theodore looked up at him blankly, and Wedge offered a pained smile in response.
Now is the time for you to believe in your parents' blood. You must believe in yourself.
Wedge. Theodore stammered.
What are you going on about? My trial is over, right? I'm a Red Wing now. Why the pep talk?
Biggs guffawed, shaking his head as he crossed his arms over his chest.
You're not going to be for much longer if you keep up this foolishness. What's your problem, Theodore?
Theodore turned to him with bewildered eyes, his face twisted in confusion.
Wait. What?
Wedge clenched his jaw, digging his fingers harder into Theodore's skin.
Don't you remember what Cain taught you?
A daydream of corn silk and opalescent wyvern wings filled Theodore's vision, his heart pounding with a puzzling ache as he found himself stumbling back against his bed, collapsing on the lumpy, down-stuffed mattress. Cain? That name? How could they possibly? He's been missing for years. Since before I was born. He clasped his hand to his mouth, another tear sliding down his cheek. No. No, 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 no. Cain. Mother. Father. A brilliant, holy light. The vicious melody of flesh torn asunder. The splash of Lunarian blood upon immaculate crystal. Golbez. My waking nightmare is my reality. And this is the dream. Theodore gasped, pressing his hand to his chest. He could feel the birth of a miraculous light inside of him once again, a moonlit promise from long ago made manifest through the blessed blood that roared inside his veins. He rose to his feet, brandishing his sword and lifting it high into the air. The chipped steel of his blade became encased in a lustrous light, transforming into the star-threaded, adamantite-forged holy blade, Excalibur. The light rushed down the rest of his body, infusing his blood with moonlight and filling the airship cabin with blinding radiance as Theodore's platinum locks transformed into the same color as his piercing gaze.
Yes.
Wedge pumped his fist in the air.
That's it. That's the Red Wing soldier I know.
Biggs grinned, giving Theodore a salute.
Now, get the hell out of here before I need to slap another round of sense into you.
I cannot sleep just yet. My true trial as a knight has only just begun. Biggs. Wedge. Thank you for sending me off one last time. The Lunar Core. When Theodore next opened his eyes, he was greeted by the clash of onyx steel and holy light as he witnessed Cain diving from the top of a column, his lance smashing against the Dark Knight's dread blade in a last-moment parry. Rosa, who had been desperately trying to wake him, nearly cried out in surprise when his starlit eyes suddenly snapped open. Theodore climbed to his feet, a rush of blood crashing in his ears as he withdrew Excalibur. The Dark Knight parried yet another attack, shrugging Cain off as he spun around, sensing the boy's revived presence.
Who? What are you?
The Dark Knight rasped, taking in Theodore's transformed appearance and shrinking back slightly. Theodore marched toward him defiantly, raising Excalibur parallel to his chest.
Cecil is my father. Rosa is my mother. And I am their one and only son.
He feinted left, and as the Dark Knight shook himself free from his stupor and dove in for the counter, Theodore quickly pivoted right and brought his sword upon the vulnerable stretch of flesh between the knight's neck and shoulder. A spray of red scattered over the floor as the Dark Knight howled and clutched the wound with a pulsing, purple hand, his eyes narrowing into slits.
Theodore.
Rosa gasped. Be careful. As a Dark Knight. Your father was quite possibly more powerful than he is even now as a paladin.
Theodore.
The knight hissed.
You would dare insult your father by spilling his blood with such a wretched holy sword.
Theodore gritted his teeth.
You aren't my father. My father is right here.
He gestured behind him, where Cecil was still staring despondently at his brother, the only movement on his suspended body the tears that continued to spill from his eyes.
And you could never wield a sword of such righteousness.
The Dark Knight raised an eyebrow, snickering.
Theodore? You, too, deny what's in front of you? All that pretentious light has done is blind you to the truth.
He lifted his sword, running his tongue over the curve of the onyx and scarlet blade and smirking when he took in Theodore's shudder.
There is only one worthy of the most powerful dark blade in the world, the Deathbringer, and its master stands before you.
Behind him, Cain had been silently making his advance while Theodore acted as a distraction, his lance raised. Just as he was about to make his strike, the Dark Knight whirled around, barking out a laugh as a demon's bane branded shield materialized on his arm and absorbed the blow, sending a blistering shockwave up Cain's arm before he rammed the shield into the dragoon and sent him flying backwards into another pillar. Theodore ducked to the knight's exposed left side, but he was too slow. Even with his heightened agility, the Dark Knight instead snatched Theodore by his scarf, grinning wickedly as he lifted the boy off the ground and licked his teeth.
All right, Theodore. So be it. You, too, shall obtain eternity in exchange for your life.
Behind the knight's ear, the knife that had felled Golbez was spinning wildly in the air, the shrieking whistle turning Theodore's blood to ice. The spinning began to slow until its tip, still stained with Golbez's blood, was aimed directly at the boy's forehead.
Theodore!
Rosa cried, tossing her hand in the air.
Prot!
But her spell was interrupted by a thunderous growl, the same black smoke that had ensnared Cecil spiraling toward her in a frenzy and gagging her mouth. Her eyes widened as her muted screams were absorbed by the dusk, and 2 more ribbons of smoke shot out, snatching her wrists and forcing them behind her back as she was shoved to her knees. Theodore could feel the knight's hold on his throat tightening, explosions of stars igniting behind his eyelids as his throbbing lungs screamed for air. Golbez! Father! I'm sorry. You gave up so much. All for naught.
CEO. Dory.
A spark of silver light burned through Theodore's closed eyes, and for a moment, he swore he could feel the familiar embrace of his father surrounding him once again, the same embrace he had shrugged off when he had left for his trial with the Red Wings, thinking that he had all the time in the world to feel the painful embarrassment of his father pretending he was proud that his nothing of a son was finally doing something with his life. If only that foolish boy knew then what I know now. You were proud of me, weren't you, father? You always were. Even if I never gave you a reason to be. I think I get it, now. Why you gifted me with your elder brother's name. You saw within him the mote of light that no one else could. Believed in him until the bitter end. It was the same with me, wasn't it? Theodore heard the sound of the knife clattering to the ground, and warily opened one eye, coming to the realization that his chest was no longer on fire in its pursuit for oxygen. The Dark Knight was wincing in front of him, knees shaking, the hand wrapped around Theodore's throat smoking and quivering as a silver wall of light that had manifested between the 2 men penetrated the knight's armor, eating away at his flesh. At last, the Dark Knight gave in, releasing Theodore without ceremony as he quickly withdrew his bloodied hand from the light, cursing under his breath and pressing it to his chest. Theodore felt a pair of sinewy arms catch him as he fell, a familiar flash of cerulean greeting him as he tilted his head backward to take in his savior.
Father!
Theodore inhaled sharply, wondering if he had slipped into another crazy dream. Maybe the Dark Knight had already impaled his skull, and he was actually on the floor, bleeding out and waiting patiently for death. Cecil smiled down at him through a trail of dried, cracking blood streaked over his lips, gently hoisting a stunned Theodore onto his feet. Behind them, Rosa was staring, astonished, at the father-son reunion. The silver light that had shielded Theodore had seemingly come out of nowhere, blasting its way through the chamber and sending a shiver down her spine when it washed over her and Golbez. When she had at last been able to blink away the assault on her senses, a discharge of vivant crystal dust exploded behind Theodore, revealing a revived Cecil with radiance flooding his eyes once more.
Cecil!
Rosa cried, a fresh wave of tears springing to her eyes as she threw her head back, struggling desperately against the binding cold spell. Before Theodore could gather himself enough to remember what magic he needed to use to save her, Cain's voice rang out from behind the Dark Knight, and an Asuna spell washed over Rosa, setting her free. Cecil nodded to Theodore, who was still staring up at him in daze.
Let's go, Theodore. This isn't over quite yet. Okay.
Theodore nodded, fumbling a bit as he held Excalibur up to Cecil.
Your sword, father.
Cecil shook his head, pushing Theodore's hands away much to the boy's shock.
No. Not anymore. Thanks for taking your sweet time making your way back to us.
Cain smirked, the Dark Knight tearing his attention away from his wound, far too late to realize Cain had snuck behind him. Cain smashed the base of his lance into the back of the Dark Knight's head, sending him sprawling to the floor, the Deathbringer clattering at Cain's feet. With a dismissive kick, he sent it flying over to Cecil, who caught it effortlessly with his right hand as he exchanged a secret smile with the Dragoon. Whoa! Theodore blinked. It's been 17 years, but they've never fallen out of step with each other. This is the combined might of the Paladin and the Dragoon that is whispered with the same reverence as a legend back home. Unsurprisingly, the Dark Knight was not as impressed by Cecil and Cain's little show.
Tisk. I am Cecil. The true Cecil.
He growled, snatching his knife and struggling back to his feet.
You are nothing. Swords together, Theodore.
Cecil cried, and Theodore did as he was told, forming an X in the air with Excalibur crossing the Deathbringer. An explosion of blood-red sparks burst from where the blades met, igniting a scalding aura that consumed both weapons instantaneously and made Theodore's eyes widen in horror. It was as if the Deathbringer was going to consume Excalibur whole. Behind them, Rosa folded her hands in prayer, a swirling radiance wrapping around her body as the shattered crystal shards throughout the chamber began to vibrate ominously against the floor, giving rise to a chorus of shrieking glass. Her eyes flashed a heavenly violet as she lifted her head and threw one hand in the air.
Holy!
A beam of ultraviolet orbs shot out of the sky above Cecil and Theodore, crashing into the raised blades and exploding in a series of purple-white flares that made Theodore's cheeks burn. Both swords emerged from the explosion bathed in prismatic holy light, and father and son turned to each other, exchanging a single nod. Crystal clear, Theodore could hear his father's instructions for what came next in his head, even though Cecil's lips weren't moving, and he realized that this was what Rosa had meant about him being able to speak to his fellow Lunarians, even within a dream. I get it now. Theodore's heart filled with a bittersweet glee that made him want to simultaneously burst into tears and laugh aloud. He thought back to the first, and only, lesson Biggs and Wedge had taught him before turning him loose in the Adamant Isle Grotto to retrieve the Knight's emblem. It's exactly the same as executing a band. Pulling their blades parallel to their chests, Theodore silently urged the churning, sprightly holy light he had captured in his weapon to release. As the Dark Knight ran toward them, his knife raised, both Cecil and Theodore's weapons suddenly discharged, sending an overwhelming spectrum of holy imbued orbitals smashing into the Knight. The Dark Knight screamed, falling to his knees and clawing at his face, clumsily trying to pull the visor shut on his helmet to protect his eyes from the blistering light. In his hysteria, he didn't notice Cecil's shadow fall over him until it was too late. The Deathbringer, still pulsing with holy light, was pressed to the Knight's forehead. He gazed up the trail of the blade into Cecil's clear, unrelenting eyes, bleeding pathetically.
Ridiculous. How could you be Cecil? What does that make me, then?
Cecil tilted his head, a sad, mysterious smile forming.
It took me a long time to understand. But I think I finally know now. The answer is simple, you are myself, and I am you. What you speak is true. You are the me that shut himself away from the world, once upon a time. The me that could not accept what I once was, and what I might have become, had I not had the stupid luck to be the second-born son of a dreamer who longed to bring his people home. The me whose chaotic heart could not fully accept peace if it meant there were yet more sacrifices to be made.
Cain gritted his teeth as he lowered his gaze, clenching his lance with shaking white knuckles. They were sacrifices that you needed not to bear alone, my friend. If only I had been selfless enough to help shoulder the burden. I thought I was saving you by going away. I thought I was bringing you the happiness that had always just been shy of your reach. The Dark Knight dragged his knuckles away from his eyes, and Theodore covered his mouth to disguise his gasp. The Knight's eyes had faded from red to a somber, lightless blue. Just a few days ago, those had been the very same eyes Theodore saw when he had looked into the cracked mirror in that dusty little mithril village inn the night of his trial. I wonder when it was that I finally gained my own light. My own sense of worth. My pride for my family. And for my half-breed blood. He glanced over at Cain, who had quietly slipped to Rosa's side. The two of them were watching the two Cecils silently, the backs of their palms brushing against each other. Watching them, Theodore was vexingly overcome with the same anticipation one felt when they were knocking pieces of flint together, waiting for sparks to ignite. Was it when I met you, Cain? Cecil knelt to face the night, reaching for his helmet. As his fingertips brushed the black steel, the dark night let out a low hiss, the helmet starting to melt and expose a swath of pale, bruised, shadow-stained jawline.
But those days are over. You are no longer alone. Or rather, we are no longer alone.
The dark knight closed his eyes, shrinking into himself as the retreating metal on his helmet transformed into a corroding luster, rapidly spreading over the rest of his body and sinking into the spill of crystal tiles beneath them when he had been completely consumed. Cecil closed his eyes as he shakily rose to his feet and pressed the pointed end of the Deathbringer against the floor. The pool of light drained out of the crystal and laced its way through the dark blade until the crimson bleed had faded to a pale pink, the onyx steel peeling away in flakes and emerging as a swell of brilliant alabaster. Cecil retrieved the sword and swung it into his sheath, a burst of opaque, ultraviolet, pearl-like bubbles showering the floor, detonating in delicate explosions of purple light like a miniature holy spell. Theodore swallowed as he watched the light fade away. The sword. It transformed before my very eyes into a blade of hallowed light. Is that the true power of the Holy Paladin? Not able to contain himself any longer, Theodore followed his father's lead, hurriedly sheathing Excalibur and embracing Cecil's waist before anything else insane could possibly come between them. He couldn't go a second longer without ensuring that his very much alive father was actually awake and that they were no longer drowning in that girl's twisted night terror.
Father! I can't believe it. You're really back. Cecil!
Rosa screamed, diving onto Cecil from behind and throwing her arms around his neck. Cecil burst into a happy smile, trying to peel Rosa off of him before she accidentally strangled him to death and spinning her around until he could pull her against him, pressing his mouth to hers eagerly. She closed her eyes, sinking against him as Theodore made an involuntary gagging noise and yanked himself away before he became smashed between the two of them. At the sound of their son retching, Cecil and Rosa pulled away from each other, both blushing. Cain remained at a distance, a small smile on his lips as he crossed his arms over his chest. He wanted so badly to join them, but he knew that the happy reunion would be cut short soon when Cecil came to realize what had befallen Golbez. More than anything, Cain wanted the little family to have these few precious moments of peace before the gravity of their situation came crashing down around them, yet again. Cecil. There's so much I want to say. Things I've been aching to tell you for 17 years. But for now, it's enough to just be by your side again. This time, I won't run away, we'll face the darkness of what's to come, together. Cecil looked down at Theodore, giving the boy a hard smack on the back that nearly knocked him on his face.
You've become a strong man, Theodore.
Theodore blushed, scratching his head and secretly marveling at how quickly Cecil's strength had seemed to come back.
I owe it all to the people who helped me. Biggs. Wedge. Cain. And of course. Of course.
Rosa blinked, and Theodore shook his head, as if it were so obvious.
You too. Without my mother and father, I am nothing. Theodore.
Rosa pressed her fingers to her lips, sniffling. Cecil hugged Theodore, kissing his forehead as he tried to hold back tears of his own.
Thank you, my son.
Theodore bit his lip, closing his eyes and letting himself cling to Cecil until he felt his father's muscles shift beneath his arms. Cecil had twisted his torso to look at Cain, wondering why he had not come to join them. Cain was smiling weakly, a veil of despair had clouding his features. Cecil's eyes trailed to the left, noticing a still black shadow. And next to Cain, bloodied and defeated.
Oh, gods,
Cecil muttered, pulling away from Theodore and shaking his head in dismay.
No. I thought that was just a nightmare that girl was showing me.
He ran past Cain to Golbez's side, sinking to his knees as he gently turned his brother's body over so that he could see his face. Golbez's head lolled slightly, a lock of hair sliding down his forehead like spilled ink. Cecil's voice sputtered as a hiccup ruptured in his lungs.
No. How? How did you possibly find me? Cecil.
Cain kneeled beside him, lowering his head.
I'm so sorry. He wanted to do whatever he could to save you, he made his way to Varan with Rydia and flew us to this moon so we could find a cure. In the end, he asked for your forgiveness. No.
Cecil dug his fingers into his scalp, a low wail escaping as he shook his head again.
I could hear your voice. It echoed across my mind, throughout the entire ordeal. That was what kept me from withering into an empty shell. And now, you're.
He dropped his hands to his lap, the will to fight. To be angry. To be anything. Fleeing from his body, deflating every muscle cell and molecule. He felt as if he had been the one to be gutted, left to bleed out and fade to nothingness in the whirl of space.
Father.
Theodore closed his eyes, giving in to the tears rolling down his cheeks as he whimpered to himself.
I'm sorry. I should have done more. Theodore.
Rosa shook her head, pulling him against her and mumbling into his hair.
My darling. There was nothing you could do. Golbez. He made his choice. And in the end, I think it really did make him happy. Even if he didn't quite realize what it would do those he left behind. It's stupid,
Theodore spat, feeling the seething hot rage start to boil in his chest as he thought back to his conversation with Golbez on the crystal plate.
He said he wanted to help Father. To help us. How is he helping anything by not being here anymore?
The roar of his Lunarian blood pulsed in his ears, his heart throbbing in overdrive.
All of this. It's so stupid.
He yanked away from Rosa, stomping over to Golbez and shocking Cecil and Kane by throwing himself over his uncle's body.
You promised.
Theodore sobbed, clenching his jaw.
That we'd talk about seeing the moon, when this was all over. Maybe that didn't mean anything to you, but it actually meant something to me.
He clawed at the torn cloak where the knife had sliced through the roughly hewn fibers, the hair on the back of his neck standing up as his broken, gnarly fingernails made a very distinct, excruciating shriek that echoed in the silence of the chamber. The agonizing sensation shot up his fingers and into his forearm, launching a shiver down his spine.
Hey.
Theodore lifted his head, his ears ringing, and stared at Kane and Cecil through waterlogged eyes.
Did you hear that?
The Fey March.
Wait a second.
Ursula gasped, her eyes darting to the bloodied switchblade as it clattered to the floor.
Rydia. My queen.
Rydia whimpered, her fingers clutched over her abdomen as she began to fall backwards from the mountain of pillows.
Why? Rydia.
Yang bolted to her side, catching the slip of a girl in his arms before she could crash to the floor. Her face and lips were white with shock, and her eyes were two lightless orbs staring at the ceiling. He could see twin reflections of his face hanging within her dilated pupils.
She needs aid, urgently. Damnation.
Sid muttered, tearing his supply pouch off and throwing it on the floor so he could dig through it. Luca kneeled down to help, and Ursula just kept staring at Azura, her fists clenched. She had never punched an otherworldly goddess before. She wondered if today was going to be her lucky day.
Don't you have anything that can stay the blood?
Luca whimpered, and Sid pushed his goggles up and over his face, his wiry hair already matted to his forehead in a bed of sweat.
I'm looking as fast as I can, girl.
Yang shook his head despondently, not liking the way Rydia's skin was starting to grow colder against his own.
We haven't much time. She'll be lost to us if this keeps up much longer.
Ursula spun on her heel, ominously giving her knuckles a round of shudder-inducing cracks.
Master, what of the fairies that were protecting you in Capo? Might they come to Rydia's aid if you call upon them?
The sylphs. Yang widened his eyes. Of course. They can heal anyone, they've even revived me from the brink of death.
It's worth a shot, Ursula.
Yang nodded.
Good thinking.
Azura hissed between her teeth in response, diving forward to grab the fallen knife. Ursula acted fast, going in low and tackling the Eidolon Queen's legs as she managed to kick the knife out of the way, sending it spinning across the floor to Luca and Sid. In a flurry of long, pale limbs, Ursula and Azura tumbled in a fierce wrestling match in the pile of bejeweled pillows, Ursula desperate to buy her father some time. Dragging Rydia away from the crossfire, Yang gently laid her across the floor, his heart pounding as he placed his index and middle fingers against the curve of her skin just below her jawline. Her pulse was slowing by the second. He pulled off the sash tied around his shoulders and fashioned it into a bandage, wrapping it around Rydia's waist several times before tying it off to decrease the blood flow.
My sylphs! Can you hear me?
Yang whispered, watching as Rydia's drooping eyelids twitched at the sound of his voice.
Please. Help me save the one you formed a covenant with.
A serene green light washed over Rydia's form, the lilt of a fragile giggle echoing in Yang's ear as the summoner's tangled emerald hair began to sparkle with the same glimmer as the misty valley after a summer rain. A mote of the delicate light leapt into the air from Rydia's chest, spinning above her dizzily in the shape of a lotus, and Yang's breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare to even breathe, lest he blow the mystic light away. Ursula let loose a pained grunt as Azura managed to kick the girl off of her, sending her careening into the empty throne to their left that had belonged to Leviathan in the real Feymarch. As Azura directed her building rage toward Yang and Rydia, Luca removed her tomahawk from her belt, squinting as she lined up her target. She knew she couldn't outright kill Azura, not if Rydia were to have any chance of saving her, but she had to do something to keep the Eidolon distracted.
Here goes,
Luca muttered, swinging her arm back and releasing the weapon with a mighty toss. The tomahawk whistled through the air, catching one of the folds in Azura's dress and pulling her down backwards as she screamed in shock and became pinned to the floor, the tomahawk's handle sticking straight up.
Yeah!
Ursula cried, launching herself into a backflip off of the throne and delivering Azura a vicious kick to the head, knocking the queen's opulent bun out of place and sending a cascade of honey blonde hair spilling down her shoulders.
Yang!
Rydia murmured, light blooming in her gaze once more.
How?
The spinning lotus hovering over the summoner suddenly burst into the shape of a fairy, the sylph's opaque wings fluttering like a heartbeat as she drifted above Rydia's face and ran a Lilliputian hand down the curve of the girl's cheek.
It's time to wake, little princess,
the sylph cooed, giving Yang a conspiratorial wink as Rydia stared up at her, her mouth frozen half open as she struggled to gather her faculties. Yang sank back in relief, pressing his hand to his chest to calm his anxious heart. When Rydia didn't reply, the sylph flew to the other side of Rydia's face, giving her temple a kick that amounted to no more than a flick from a normal-sized creature and making Rydia jump in surprise.
Hey now! The daughter of the king and queen of Eidolons cannot just sit around and let such a travesty unfold in her very own kingdom, non. Daughter!
Rydia groaned, her stomach involuntarily clenching as she recalled the slice of the blade rendering her flesh. It had been so easy for Azura to stab her. The queen's gaze had never once wavered in hesitance as Rydia had stared up at her lovingly, a pig awaiting slaughter.
Maybe that was true once, long ago. But before the Eidolons were captured, I know, you were banished from the Feymarch,
the sylph shook her head.
Word gets around about these things, you know. Banished.
Yang blinked.
Rydia. Why did you never tell us after all this time? Did you know about this, Luca?
Sid asked, instantly recalling the summer he had flown Rydia, the twins, and Luca to the Feymarch and how strange Rydia had acted that afternoon when they had returned to the ship. Luca flushed, turning away.
Maybe. Why did I not tell anyone?
Rydia shook her head, a pained moan escaping her lips as Yang cupped her lower back to help her sit up.
Because I was ashamed of being chased out of the only place I felt truly at home. Ashamed that everyone else seemed to know what was best for me, except for myself.
She stared warily as Ursula and Azura continued to duel. The queen had managed to free herself from Luca's trap and was now going mano a mano with the Fabulian princess.
And now I've dragged all of you into my treachery. Foolish,
Azura sneered, fluidly reaching over her shoulder to unsheath her scimitar. The intricately carved blade glimmered in the flickering light of the infinite candles that lined the walls, and Ursula leapt back, eyes wide. Even she wasn't brazen enough to test her fists against steel.
A false summoner dares to enter my chambers, and so shall die by my judgment.
False. Rydia gasped.
My queen. Please, stop this. It's me, Rydia. I am no fake. It's no use.
The sylph squeaked.
She's under the control of that girl. But she felt so alive.
Rydia sniffled, and the sylph crossed her arms over her chest defiantly, giving Rydia another kick on the tip of her sloped nose. Rydia reeled back, clenching her jaw as the sylph shook her head.
No matter how alive she may seem, she's still a walking corpse as long as that girl holds sway over her heart. Stand up, Rydia, and fight for what's yours, or Azura will take away everyone that you love. Come on, Rydia.
Luca cried as she and Sid ran to her side, each one of them grasping hold of an arm and lifting the stunned girl to her feet.
You've got this. We can stop here. After we save Azura, we still gotta find Cecil and Edge. You have no reason to feel ashamed,
Sid said gently.
It matters not that you were ever banished from the Feymarch. The concept of home is not a place, my dear. Take it from an old geezer who's seen a lot of things in his 70 years. 71,
Luca corrected, and Sid shot her a glare punctuated by a shaking fist. As hard as she tried to fight it, Rydia felt her mouth jerk into a slight smile.
Ahem. As I was saying, kingdoms fall, dwellings sculpted by man are overtaken by nature, and sometimes, I suppose, even entire stars are blighted from the sky. But no matter what universe we may find ourselves in, home is always here.
He took Rydia's hand, gently laying it over her chest.
Our hearts, the hearts of our family and loved ones, and those of our friends. That is where humans are meant to draw comfort. And I'd bet every last airship I ever built that the same goes for Eidolons, too. Is that so?
Rydia murmured, clenching her chest.
The Ancient One speaks true,
the sylph said, fluttering in a semicircle to face Azura.
Hurry, Rydia. There's not much time left. You must make your decision. Decision?
Rydia blinked, but the sylph disappeared in a flash of blinding light, saying nothing more. But then it came to her. What the petite Eidolon had meant. Rydia knew, deep inside her core, that Azura was the one who held the keys to the kingdom. That was why she had been waiting there for them, after all. She also knew, thanks to the glitch in the library, that their surroundings were being purposely force-fed to them, and that included any enemies that called the false Feymarch home. A battle with Azura was the last stand before achieving freedom. The mysterious girl had wanted to make Rydia suffer in every capacity possible. But this time, Rydia didn't need to gather a rogue Eidolon's power to penetrate a magic shield. This time, slaying their enemy was an option. Ursula suddenly came barreling at them from mid-air, having miscalculated a flying kick that was countered by Azura's blowing her away with a protect spell. Yang jumped forward to catch her, the girl crashing into his arms clumsily as he braced his knees and slid several feet back on the floor from the impact.
Are you okay?
Yang asked, and Ursula nodded dizzily, her headband slipping over her eyes.
Yes. Master. I'm sorry I couldn't keep her distracted longer. Shush, foolish girl,
Yang commanded, but he was smiling slightly.
You did beautifully.
What am I going to do? Rydia panicked. My friends aren't fighting at full strength because they are trying to save her, but if we keep this up much longer, she will overpower us and we'll be buried here. How can I wake Azura up if she's convinced I'm the fake? That girl. She did this so that there would be no way I could win. But if Azura is placated by my removal, she may let the others proceed unharmed. And if she does not, they will be willing to fight her, and they would undoubtedly win. Azura is powerful, but she is still but only one against many. If they combined their strengths, they would surely overcome her, just as I once did with Cecil and the others. Rydia raised her head, swallowing the bile rising in her throat as she took a defiant step toward the rampaging queen. Surprisingly, Azura lowered her blade, arching one perfect brow and tilting her head.
Have you come to accept your fate, Mimic?
Azura sneered, and Rydia took a deep breath, clenching her fists.
Yes. Execute me for my crimes, if you must. Rydia.
A chorus of screams and protests erupted behind her. She raised one hand, silencing them. Before Rydia could blink, Azura snatched her by the collar of her leotard, throwing the girl down to her knees and holding her in place with one hand, while the other rose high in the air with the sword. Rydia's gaze followed the blade through its journey in the air, grateful that the blur of tears acted as a shroud to hide what was to come next. Her eyes flicked to Azura's, who was staring down at her with a hatred so overwhelming that Rydia thought for sure the chamber itself would spontaneously combust.
No, please.
Luca suddenly burst out, half sobbing and half screaming as Sid struggled to hold her back.
Rydia, this isn't the way.
I'm so sorry. Rydia closed her eyes, biting down on her lip as she slowly lowered her head. But I fear there is no other choice. I have to see this through, even if it means my end. That's what you would do? Right, Cecil? The whoosh of the blade cutting through the air made the hair on the back of Rydia's neck stand up on end. Then came the torturous chill, like 1,000 icicles were piercing her skin, and deafening silence. Concentrating on the flutter of her fading pulse in her ear, Rydia made a final plea to the stars and any gods that might be listening. I wish, more than anything else in this world, that I can be reborn as an Eidolon, so that I can pledge my heart eternal to the ones I love.
What? What is this?
Rydia's mouth twitched. That was Azura's voice, wasn't it? Wait. I'm not dead. Slowly, she opened her eyes, finding herself surrounded by a swirling shade of opalescence. Azura was cowering over her, her eyes wide and tears spilling down her cheeks as Rydia watched the scimitar fall from her hand and pierce the floor only inches away from her bowed head.
It's been a while, Mother.
A soothing alto that felt like a hug from an old friend was pouring over Rydia, ringing in the chamber as clear and crisp as church bells. Turning her head in confusion, she saw no one the voice could have possibly belonged to. She only saw Yang, Sid, Ursula, and Luca, their faces masks of shock. Suddenly, a soul-chilling rush of breath expelled from Rydia's lungs, unbidden, and she watched as the shade before her swirled into a column and became the shape of a young man, dressed in the same ornate, silver-threaded robes she used to see on all the monsters in the Feymarch, a crowning glory of silky platinum blue hair, low-lighted with violet streaks, tumbling down his back in waves. Though she couldn't see his face, she had a most certain vision in her mind's eye that he had beautiful turquoise eyes.
Kasumi,
Azura breathed.
Are you not an illusion as well?
The man shook his head, and Rydia felt a few delicate drops of misty spray sprinkle over her nose as he did so.
I'm really here. I'm sorry that it took me so long. The surface world of our beloved star is in much agony. It's taking everything I have to protect just my village, yet I can feel the planet crying out from every corner. All creatures, from all walks of life, are suffering. It won't be long until it's all over. I'm afraid our plane will fall alongside the underworld and the overworld once the planet is decimated. Our home is in danger,
Azura whispered, shaking her head.
Impossible. I've been keeping guard this entire time and have felt nothing within the Feymarch. That's why I'm here,
Kasumi said, reaching for Azura's hand.
To wake you from this long nightmare. It's thanks to Rydia that I was able to find you again. You must rejoin the covenant you share and help her fight the evil that threatens us all. She has rescued your beloved subjects and seeks to free the king and the All-Father too. Rydia.
Azura pressed her fingers to her lips, now staring pointedly over Kasumi's shoulder at the cowering summoner.
But then that means that I almost...
Her cheeks went pale as she sank to her knees, covering her face and releasing a harrowing howl.
Your Majesty!
Rydia cried, outstretching her hand. Her fingers brushed through the man's leg, and he turned to face her, his body fading into a curtain of dissipating mist just before she could make out his face. His peaceful voice echoed in the air, causing both Rydia and Azura to look up in unison.
I'll always be by your side, Rydia. Thank you for letting me see her one last time.
What? What just happened? Rydia blinked, wrinkling her mist-covered nose. That man? He couldn't have possibly been... And then came the faint cry of a dragon, confirming her suspicions.
Rydia!
Azura turned her gaze upon her, her violet eyes awash with sorrow.
I am sorry. Thanks to the strength of your will, I finally managed to escape the clutches of that evil girl.
Rydia shook her head quickly.
Please, don't, I'm just so glad you recognize me again. I'm so happy to see you. It feels as if it has been years since that terrible day.
The two women embraced tightly, Azura smoothing down Rydia's waves as she drank in the presence of Rydia's friends standing before them. Yang bowed deeply, elbowing Ursula hastily to do the same. Flushing, Ursula quickly dipped down, wondering how forgiving the queen might be about the serious beatdown she had gifted her. Sid's face erupted into a ruddy blush as he finally got a good, long, not clouded by fear look at all of Azura's assets. And Luca, already bored of this whole thing now that the handsome, at least, she figured he was handsome from what she had seen from behind, interloper had disappeared, merely gave a nod and tilted her visor.
I apologize, Rydia.
Azura pulled back, resting her hands square on Rydia's shoulders.
The way that I chased you out from the Feymarch. I just didn't know what else to do. I fell into a panic when I felt that girl's presence and wasn't thinking straight. No. Don't blame yourself. You were only trying to do what was best for me. I understand that now.
Azura flushed, shaking her head.
Oh, Rydia. I've wanted for so long to see you again. You were so brave to make it this far, braver than I will ever be in this lifetime, or the next. Your Majesty.
Rydia sniffled, throwing her arms around Azura's neck and burying her face into the heavenly cushion of Azura's freed locks.
From now on, I shall always be together with you. Feel free to call upon me whenever you please. Why yes, my queen.
Rydia peered up at her, rubbing away a stray tear.
But may I ask just one question before we depart? That man. Kasumi. I never knew you had a son. Why didn't you ever tell me? Ah.
Azura smiled, her voice taking on a dreamy lilt as she shook her head.
I guess it just never occurred to me that you didn't already know. At this point in my life, I've spent far more years without my beloved son by my side than I have with. He was, of course, born as heir to the Feymarch, should something ever happen to the king or I, and he is the All-Father's one and only grandson. But he so loved the surface world and had become enamored with a summoner beyond what one would consider just a normal pact between human and Eidolon. He made the decision to remain by her side for eternity, while his physical form as a dragon remained on the astral plane until he was summoned. His soul became bound to the summoner he had sworn to protect. That was your mother, Adeline, of course. My mother.
Rydia shook her head, flabbergasted.
He loved her beyond all else,
Azura smiled.
But of course, a human and an Eidolon could never be together. I think he recognized that fairly early on in his infatuation, but he loved her dearly enough to ensure she could live a peaceful and happy life by becoming the protector of her village. So strong was their bond, that when he was slain in battle, Adeline fell too. But I suppose you know the rest. Yes.
Rydia pressed her lips together.
But in the end, he was still a phantom of another world, and when Mommy fell, his soul was eventually freed to make a covenant with another. Yet, he still protects your village to this day. And his Adeline's most precious treasure has now become his.
Azura tucked a lock of hair behind Rydia's ear, tilting her head.
That ruby I gave you. It was Kashumi's parting gift to me so very long ago. He told me that the village he had sworn himself to bloomed in a riot of hyacinths all year round, impervious to the seasons of the rest of the planet. He carved one in ruby to remind me of him whenever I was lonely. When I first laid eyes on you, I knew right away what a special child you were. I could see the holy aura Kasumi had bestowed upon you, and I still perhaps wonder if that is what ultimately drove Leviathan's madness in his bringing you here in the first place. In another reality, had the fates been kinder, you could have been my Kashumi's heir. It was the very moment we met that I decided the hyacinth should be passed to you.
A relic doubly blessed with the love of a son for his mother, and a mother's love for those her son vowed to protect, Rydia smiled. That's how I was able to free the other Eidolons from their nightmares. It wasn't just the power of my heart, but the hearts of so many others, entwined and rendered invincible. She gazed back at her friends, tears stinging her eyes as she gave them a reassuring smile. I understand everything now. My friends. They are my greatest weakness, but also my most powerful strength, a strength that spans universes, dimensions, time, all that is human and all that is Eidolon. That's why Azura wanted me to be with them. Because she understood, thanks to Kasumi, where my home really was this entire time. She was just waiting for me to figure that out on my own, same as he. But we haven't much time left, we have to escape this place and find the others before it's too late. That girl will be furious that Azura has been freed, she'll know before long if she doesn't know already.
Your Majesty, do you know where Leviathan is?
Rydia frowned.
We've searched this entire village, but you're the only soul we've come across thus far.
Azura turned to Rydia once more, extending her hand.
I can take you to Leviathan, there will be no escaping this place without facing him. I am sure, that girl is a sadistic enough creature to enjoy such a show. Are you prepared for what you may have to do, Rydia? I have no choice,
Rydia replied firmly, grasping Azura's hand.
Please. Take me to him. No matter who stands in my way. I must stop the one who threatens our home world.
The lunar core. Cecil warily lifted his head, and Kane nodded, his mouth set in a straight line.
What was that?
Rosa blinked, approaching Theodore from behind.
It sounded like someone running a blade over glass.
Theodore turned to Golbez and swallowed back the bile he could feel creeping up his throat as he reached down and swiftly unfastened the cloak. He didn't want to give himself enough time to change his mind. The folds of fabric fell away, revealing a devastating sight, a spill of diamond-esque crystal slivers and larger, jagged shards pouring out of the containment of the cloak, some tinged in blood, some shining unblemished like a prism held to sunlight. A few of the shards were embedded in Golbez's chest, a collection of small, clotted wounds that appeared to be where most of the now-dried blood had come from. But what was perhaps most disturbing was the lack of an expected puncture wound from the knife. There was a distinctive gash over Golbez's heart where the blade would have made contact. But even so, it was far too shallow.
What is all this?
Rosa gasped. Cecil plucked one of the bigger crystal shards out of Golbez's chest, narrowing his eyes as he held it before him.
This crystal. It's so familiar. But none of the blue planet's crystals are that color,
Kane frowned.
Nor the red moons, if I'm remembering correctly. Golbez told us they were all shattered, at any rate. But I do know this crystal,
Cecil insisted, his voice rising slightly as the memories came flooding back in a moonlight-stained flux. 17 years prior.
Brother.
Golbez opened his fingers slowly, revealing the crystal within. It was dwarfed in his massive hands, the color of a diamond, and had a rainbow sheen that sparkled in the dying starlight.
Cecil. It must be you.
Golbez wheezed and dropped the crystal from his hands. Cecil picked it up, feeling an unmistakable warmth flood his body, the same warmth he felt when he held the crystals of the blue planet. The warmth of a crystal shedding its light. He looked to Golbez's fading form as if to ask what to do. How was this the key to unveiling Zemus's true form?
The ninth crystal,
Cecil whispered, the shard between his fingers starting to glow a faint blue that made his eyes glint like polished sapphires.
The only crystal the Lunarians managed to save when their planet was destroyed. It was meant to be a gift to the blue planet when the time came for our people to live among each other.
I filled this crystal with my light, with the very essence of life itself, to defeat Zemus once and for all. After the battle, Fosoya took it with him when he and Golbez left us to sleep. So how did it end up here? Cecil gently placed the glowing shard on Golbez's chest, and the rest of the pieces of the crystal began to glow alongside it, emitting a tender warmth that radiated from Golbez's exposed skin. Theodore began to sob harder at the thought of his ancestors being chased away from their planet by a monstrous force, realizing that their pain and sacrifice had only been a catalyst for history to repeat itself with his own planet too short a time later. His tears splashed over the spill of crystals, sending a ripple of light seizing through Golbez's body, a spray of moonlight dancing over the ocean's waves. Why? Why do I have this power if I cannot use it to save what matters most? What's the point of any of this suffering if the world is just going to die?
Cecil.
The whisper that drifted into the stillness was gravelly, exhausted, pained, but encapsulated with promise. Theodore's sob stalled in his throat as he watched the crystal Cecil had lain upon Golbez's chest slide down the curve of his skin and clatter without ceremony onto the floor. He could feel his mother's hands clenching his shoulders, her own breath held in anticipation.
Golbez.
Cecil gasped, and his brother's lips twitched slightly in response. The small avalanche of crystal shards joined the first, tumbling down his chest and abdomen as a swell of breath flooded his lungs, two dull violet slits greeting the Baronians.
You're alive.
Theodore shrieked, and Golbez winced in reply, which Theodore officially decided was the best reaction he had ever gotten from someone that he thought he'd never see again. Rosa's face flushed with happiness, and she immediately went to work casting Curaja. Bathed in sparkling rainbow light from the spell, Golbez lifted himself slightly higher, using his elbows to prop himself as he stared, bewildered, at Cecil and Kane.
What happened?
He then glanced down at his chest, the rest of the crystal debris falling away and leaving a faint trail of sparkles over his heart that caught the dying light in the chamber.
What is all this? It was the ninth crystal Fosoya took back from Cecil after Zemus was defeated. You weren't holding on to it this entire time.
Cain asked, eyebrows raised, and Golbez shook his head.
No, I held possession of no crystal. I felt something hot inside my chest right before everything went black, but I don't remember anything after. I thought my body was just going into shock from the attack.
I get it, Cecil suddenly blurted out, everyone turning to stare at him. He grabbed one of the shards that had fallen to the floor, holding it in front of Golbez's chest. Once again, the shard pulsed prettily with blue that highlighted the shadow-scarred ultraviolet of Golbez's stare.
Golbez, what happened to the crystal before you and Fusoya went to sleep? I'm not sure,
Golbez frowned.
He used some sort of spell to send it away. I figured he was just hiding it in the same dimension in which he had kept it until we confronted Zemus. There are many layers of hidden dimensions where the Lunarians sleep, it's all warped, distorted space to keep them safe from outside invaders. When he went to sleep, the crystal was not in his hands, nor did I see it with him before I came to the blue planet a few days ago.
Cecil nodded, as if this was exactly what he had been expecting to hear.
I believe that Fusoya would have hidden it away before he went to sleep. There would have been no need for the crystal to be left vulnerable, even with Zemus gone. But he didn't send it to another dimension. I think he hid it inside of you, Golbez, and when you were in mortal danger, the crystal awakened and saved your life.
What? Golbez shook his head, confusion igniting his eyes.
Such a foolish notion, even coming from you, Cecil.
Cain couldn't help but snicker at Golbez's familiar scorn, and Theodore's jaw dropped. Golbez noticed his nephew's adverse reaction and shrugged, having the decency to at least pretend to be sheepish.
Sorry. Old habit, I suppose. What I meant to say was, I can't use this crystal. I've never been able to. A heart steeped in darkness cannot possibly bid a crystal to shed its light. I believe we established that fact long ago when I originally tried to use it on Zemus.
The insulting comment didn't even register with Cecil. He merely tapped the crystal shard to Golbez's chest, staring relentlessly into Golbez's eyes.
Maybe that's exactly why Fusoya left it in your care. For light to shine, there must be darkness, and for a shadow to be cast, there must be light. Each sustains the other. Your heart kept the crystal safely hidden, and in turn, it shed its light for you when you needed it most.
Golbez said nothing as he took the shard from Cecil's outstretched hand, narrowing his eyes in thought and turning it over in his fingers. There was a brief flash, and for a moment, he swore he saw Fusoya's watery blue gaze peering at him through the now dulled glass. Fusoya. You knew all along, didn't you? You knew from the moment you woke up that I would join the others on the blue planet. And that you were going to send me alone, with the crystal, the last remaining relic of our people. You knew the Red Moon was to perish. And even still, it was me you chose to save. If Golbez wasn't so painfully aware of the rather awkward marvel of having 4 pairs of eager eyes boring into him, he might have allowed himself the indignity of having a cry. But he supposed something like that would have to wait for later. He knew he hadn't been given a second chance just to wallow in the nostalgia of what could have been. Cecil had somehow made it back to them safely while he was deep asleep, the crystal's light coursing through his veins and rushing to make him whole again, but his little brother's awakening was only a fraction of what they had needed to accomplish, and time was quickly running out. Cain slugged Cecil on the arm, grinning.
It's been far too long since I've enjoyed one of your rambling soliloquies, Cecil.
Cecil turned to face him, slugging him back twice as hard. Rosa couldn't help but silently delight as she watched the two of them. She felt as if she were a teenager again, observing them playfully brawl in the pub after another long mission.
To say nothing of you and your biting wit, Cain.
He shook his head, blushing fiercely.
My dearest family. I simply don't know how to thank all of you enough. You could help us with taking down this moon,
Rosa smiled.
And when we get back home, maybe you could take over the planning of Theodore's celebration, as well. Mother.
Theodore groaned, having totally forgotten how embarrassing an affair that was going to be, and Cecil laughed.
Whatever you want, my dear. It's yours.
He turned to Theodore, smiling.
I'm excited to hear about your trial once we're back home. But I never doubted you would come back to us a night. I could tell as soon as the darkness was lifted from my eyes that something powerful inside of you had awoken. Father.
Now it was Theodore's turn to blush. Maybe a little party when they made it back home wouldn't be so bad after all, there would be a lot more to celebrate than just him, after all. Cecil rose, extending his hand toward Golbez. The sorcerer reluctantly grabbed hold, worried that him being back to full strength would overpower his comparatively diminutive brother. Cecil had felt as slight as a feather the entire time Golbez had been carrying him. But Cecil's vitality held firm, his body not swaying an inch as he hauled Golbez back to his feet. The two men stared at each other for a moment, Golbez finally dropping Cecil's hand and crossing his arms over his chest.
So, now what?
Cecil didn't skip a beat.
Now, we make haste. We must stop this moon and ensure the future of our homeland. You can fill me in on everything I've missed along the way. Ha! You've made it this far, then.
A portal of blue light tore open the floor in front of them a few feet away, where the crystal throne had sat before being decimated. Out of it leaped the mysterious girl, or at least, one of her copies, her smile never wavering even as her bare feet crunched against the sharp crystal shards scattered about. Cecil clenched his teeth, immediately reaching for his sword, and Kane, Rosa, Golbez, and Theodore protectively flocked around him. The mysterious girl chuckled at this, motioning with her hand as if she were trying to calm a rowdy pen of kindergartners.
Cecil has returned to you, I see. But it means nothing. Your planet has completed its role. Its fate has not changed one bit. Nor has yours. Cecil was just a means to an end. It's a shame you wasted what little time you had left trying to save him. How dare you talk about someone we love so dearly as if he means nothing?
Rosa hissed.
And what do you mean, our planet's role?
Theodore bit his lip. What in the world was that witch going on about now? Maybe there was a time when I hated my role in life, my role on our planet as the Prince of Baron. That all ended once I embarked on this journey. That role I hated. It was all just in my own head, and now I know what's most precious in this life.
And while you are answering our questions, what's your role in all this?
Golbez pointed at her threateningly, her gaze following his finger as she cloyingly bit her lip.
Don't you think it's about time you've enlightened us? I've chased you through 3 celestial bodies, now. And I've had about enough.
She smirked.
I suppose it is all too incomprehensible for such earthbound maggots as you to understand. I won't bother explaining if you're still not able to figure it out. But I will be fair. You are free to choose how your deaths play out. This is your final decision, I leave it up to you to make. Is that what you've determined?
Kane forced a laugh.
A shame. We haven't given up yet, I'm afraid. Run away, if you feel so compelled. This won't be the last you see of us. Fate is not something set in stone,
Cecil glared.
If you want to change it, all you have to do is believe, I'm proof enough of that.
The mysterious girl sighed.
I grow bored of this.
She opened another portal behind her and stepped inside, shooting the party a filthy glare.
My offer still stands, I'll be anxious to see which path you take to your doom.
And with that, she disappeared from sight, but the portal she had originally arrived in remained open on the floor, beckoning to the 5 of them.
Do you think we'll find whoever is doing this to us in there?
Theodore blinked, and Cecil reluctantly lowered his hand from his weapon, swallowing painfully.
What makes you think it's not just the girl behind all this? Well.
Theodore bit his lip. The dream he had had on the lunar whale was still bothering him. That cold, but lonely, voice still resonated in the very depths of his heart.
Darkness. Light. In the end, none of it matters.
That voice spoke like those girls do. Disconnected from existence itself and lackadaisical.
I guess I don't know for sure,
Theodore backpedaled, and Rosa sighed.
We have no choice but to press forward, and we still need to find the others, too. Others?
Cecil frowned.
You mean to tell me? Rydia, Edge, Sid, Edward, Yang, the twins. We brought an entire army with us this time,
Kane said.
And then some. You'll see in good time, I'm sure. Because everyone was so worried about you,
Rosa added, and Cecil lowered his head.
I appreciate it. From the bottom of my heart. But I don't know how I'll even begin to repay my debt. You can worry about that later,
Golbez grunted. He felt compelled to keep Cecil's spirits bolstered, being that he knew exactly how his little brother felt.
We haven't the time to sit here and dwell. Right?
Cecil nodded.
Thank you.
He turned to the portal and took a deep breath. He had no idea what to expect to find on the other side. He felt like a newborn, senses alit and buzzing with every new taste, smell, sight, and sound since his veil of darkness had been lifted away. He could only pray that they were not too late. That in the end, the role he had played in this saga would not be the one to doom their beautiful planet. If he believed, they would surely be blessed with another miracle. Right? The Fey March, Outskirts. The stretch of land, each side surrounded by an ocean of bubbling magma, at last came to a dead end near a blackened, jagged flank of rock that stretched upward into infinity. Whether it was a mountain or perhaps merely the end of the simulation that had been planted for them, Rydia could not tell. But sitting on the ledge of the land, his back turned toward them with his legs crossed and his palms overturned over each knee, was a familiar old man with a shock of wiry white hair running down his back and partially hidden under a shabby, patched many times over stocking cap. Cautiously stepping forward, Rydia extended her right hand, trying to keep the quiver in her voice to a minimum.
My lord. What are you doing here?
There came no reply. Shivering, Rydia took another step, wondering how anyone alive could possibly be as still as the Eidolon king at that moment. Behind her, Azura stood guard, her hair drifting like liquid gold as a molten blast of heat vented from a crater nearby, and Yang, Ursula, Sid and Luca had taken position behind Azura, all at Rydia's insistence. I can't risk their lives again. I know what I must do if there is no bringing Leviathan back. And I won't let them become complicit in the most heinous of sins, patricide.
My lord.
Rydia tried again, and at last, Leviathan turned to face her, his miles-long beard embedded in ash and slow-burning embers from the magma that had bubbled up uncontrollably and splashed upon him. The rest of his robes were also covered in burn marks and holes where the fabric had been completely eaten away, his eyes dull holes of milky white that Rydia had only ever seen when he was fully transformed as a sea serpent. Azura drew in a sharp breath, shaking her head.
So, it's true. He's fallen to the enemy, too. Please, my lord. Wake up.
Rydia cried.
Can't he hear us?
Luca asked softly.
What's going on?
Suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped inside Leviathan, filling him with surging energy, he charged forward with all the speed and agility of a striking cobra, snatching Rydia by the neck and lifting her high in the air as he extended to his full magnificent height, normally disguised with his sloppy posture and diminutive personality he took on when in his human form. Gasping for air, Rydia kicked her legs furiously, clawing at his vein-streaked hands to no effect.
My king.
Azura barked, unsheathing her sword and jamming the hilt into Leviathan's stomach. He stumbled back as the breath was knocked out of him, dropping Rydia like a discarded toy. Luca and Sid hurried to her side, but she brushed them off, still desperate to draw air back into her lungs as she struggled to her feet. She could already feel the bruises starting to bloom around her neck, her throat aching warningly when she finally summoned the strength to speak.
No. Please. Stay far away.
Leviathan glared up at Azura as he clutched his abdomen, and the queen marched up to him, waving her sword threateningly.
Have they stolen your soul as well as your body?
Leviathan continued to seethe, his glare now fixating on Rydia as she shrunk away, stumbling a few steps back behind Azura. Azura awarded this affront with a slap across his face, her gaudy rings leaving multifaceted imprints in the apple of his cheek.
Don't you understand me? It is I, Azura, and here is Rydia, the daughter you hold so dear. Please, your highness. You must remember.
Rydia tried, clasping her hands together.
I don't want to hurt you. Please open your eyes. What's wrong with him?
Ursula asked.
He's not acting at all like Azura was, the lights are on, but no one's home. This is what Rydia had to face with all of the other Eidolons she rescued,
Luca explained.
They were just mindless husks that the mysterious girl was manipulating from within their hearts, they didn't recognize her or even understand her when she spoke. She was able to use the light of her hairpin to bring them to their senses. Golbez told her that Ruby had the property to dispel nightmares, and it worked brilliantly until Titan ground it to dust. Golbez told her that.
Sid's shock was evident even with the sweltering steam and heat fogging up his goggles.
You mean? He actually helped you guys out? Yes, several times,
Luca nodded, biting her lip.
In all honesty, I wish he were here right now. I bet he would think of something to finally put an end to all this.
Naive girl, Sid sighed, turning away. While Rydia and Azura pled with Leviathan to come to his senses, the Lord of the Seas had been silently conjuring a spell under his breath, the rolling waves of magma surrounding them rising into higher and higher swells by the minute. By the time Azura had noticed the overpowering waves that were rising behind her, it was too late to stop them. She could barely manage to sling a round of reflect magic on the party before the blistering assault. The boiling tidal wave bounced off the rainbow shields that had manifested in front of the party, slamming into Leviathan and washing him away as he let out a devastated howl, sinking under the magma.
No!
Rydia shrieked, diving forward and grabbing at Leviathan's outstretched hand as the undertow of the spell dragged him away. Buckets of sweat poured down her face and neck as she felt the magma rapidly eat away at the remains of her shield, throwing all of her strength into one last mighty tug. Leviathan flopped back onto the land, the hair-curling stench of burning flesh filling Rydia's nostrils as he stared up at her, dead-eyed. "Remember who I am," Rydia silently begged, clutching the old man's hands within her own. She saw a vein throb in his temple, and suddenly found herself flipped onto her back, the wind knocked out of her body as Leviathan appeared before her in another flash, his hands sinking into her lips and jaw and forcing her head toward the pool of magma below.
"Stop! Please, stop!"
Azura commanded, but Leviathan responded by summoning another tidal wave to keep them busy. Turning his attentions back to Rydia, she watched with terror-stricken eyes as he wordlessly resumed his attempt at her drowning, mechanically adjusting his hands and the level of pressure applied as she flailed beneath him. "Is this really it?" Rydia gulped, the sickening smell of scorched hair her final warning that she had to make her move or render her life forfeit. "To come this far, and have to take the life of someone I love. I just can't do it. Cecil. Edge. Forgive my selfish heart." Rydia squeezed her eyes shut, uttering the name of her mother's dragon as she felt Leviathan's fingers digging into her windpipe in an effort to cease her struggling. The mist dragon emerged above her and Leviathan in a burst of fog and moonlight, throwing his head back and releasing a pained scream that echoed ominously against the infinite cavern. Her breath failing her, Rydia tried to picture the dragon's turquoise gaze in her mind's eye as explosions of stars and numbing darkness overtook her senses. Her body was executing a final act of mercy, surely her nervous system would completely shut down before her head was plunged beneath the magma so that she at least wouldn't have to feel the excruciation of being boiled alive. "My beloved dragon. My final request is to be bathed in holy mist." She heard another scream, feeling Leviathan's fingers lift off of her in confusion as the soothing sprinkle of pure, chilled mist fell over her body and danced in glimmering beads over her skin, transforming her into the living embodiment of one of the overworld's crystals. She could feel her assailant's weight slowly lifting from her body. When she opened her eyes and attempted to lift her head, she found herself now unfettered, and face to face with a shrinking Leviathan, whose eyes once again flourished with divine light. The mist dragon tilted his head inquisitively, but having completed his mistress' command, soared into the darkness above, disappearing from sight.
Redai.
Leviathan gasped, and Rydia smiled weakly, a bead of mist sliding down her jaw.
"My lord? Do you recognize me now?" "Rydia."
Leviathan pulled her into his arms, nuzzling his face into her hair as he nodded his head, not that she could see him, being smashed into his chest.
"Oh, my sweet, cherished Rydia. What did you do to wake him up?"
Azura cried, warding off the final throes of Leviathan's final incantation and rushing over to them, the others following closely behind.
"The mist dragon didn't even attack." "I didn't ask him to attack,"
Rydia said softly, managing to lift her head as Leviathan grasped her yet tighter.
"I asked him to cover me in mist. I remembered what you said right before we came here. That I had been surrounded in a holy aura the first time we met. I thought that if I could not be seen, then perhaps I could be sensed, instead. If it had been enough to drive Leviathan berserk and capsize a ship to get to me, then I thought it might work now, too." "Damn, that's even better than anything Golbez might have come up with,"
Luca muttered, and Rydia's eyebrows shot up. She must have missed something, or she was still a bit out of it from having her oxygen cut off for so long.
"Please forgive me, Rydia,"
Leviathan sighed, finally pulling away so that she could get another full gulp of air.
"So many Eidolons forced into agony because I lacked the power to help them."
He gazed up at Azura apologetically.
"My love included." "It doesn't matter now, my lord. Not now that you have returned."
Rydia smiled, and Azura shrugged.
"I'll need a few more pieces of jewelry to add to my collection as repayment. You would best ransack some ships from one of the more richer countries upon our return." Maybe don't do that,"
Rydia laughed nervously.
"If you want beautiful jewelry, it's probably easiest to just enter a store in your human form, and, you know, By some. Less life-threatening for all involved, as well. Well, I couldn't have made it back without my family. Both you, Rydia, and my beloved Azura.
He gazed up at the sky for a moment, pressing his lips together.
You too, Kasumi. Wherever you are right now. Thank the gods that's over,
Ursula huffed.
So, are you going to tell us how to get out of here, or what? I want to see my Uncle Cecil. Ursula.
Yang chided, but Leviathan chuckled, shaking his head.
I can't say no to another beautiful face like that,
he said, and Yang bared his teeth perhaps a little more intensely than he had intended. Ignoring him, Leviathan rolled over, idly drawing a magic circle near the ledge where Rydia had nearly met her maker. When his finger lifted away, the circle erupted into a starlit portal, identical to the one Ursula had first identified in the heart of the false Feymarch. Leviathan turned to the others, his smile now gone and his eyes in crinkled slits.
We cannot leave our world victim to that girl's whims a moment longer. From now on, my powers shall be with you forevermore. I'll see to it that nothing ever comes between us again. Thank you for everything. Both of you.
Rydia bowed her head, and in turn, Azura and Leviathan faded away in a swath of glimmering light, dancing yellow orbs releasing into the air like soap bubbles. Rydia felt the familiar warmth flood her body as their essences became one with hers once again, their covenant sealed. Luca bounded over to the portal, wrinkling her nose as she paused to look it over.
Yoza. Something stinks. What?
Rydia blinked, spinning around. Luca fanned her face and made a big production of plugging her nose.
Ugh, girl, it's you. Half of your hair is burned to a crisp. What?
Rydia gathered her hair into her hands and tossed it over her shoulder, the blood draining from her face when she saw that Luca was right. The length of Rydia's hair from her thighs to her middle back was charred black, some hunks fused together thanks to the magma Leviathan had forced her into, and other layers already completely burned off, leaving uneven, jagged spills across her back. She gave her foot a stomp, silently mourning years and years of effort to grow her stubborn hair long enough so that her natural corkscrew curls were finally somewhat tameable.
Here, hun,
Sid said, reaching into his belt and retrieving a utility knife.
Best just take care of it now, who knows what we might run into next.
Rydia took the knife from his hand, muttering something under her breath about killing Leviathan after all as she gathered her hair into a fist, extending the makeshift ponytail over her shoulder and biting her lip.
Here goes nothing.
With a heavy sigh and a violent slash, a blanket of black, dead hair fluttered into the waiting magma, one emerald curl going unnoticed as it sank into the portal and disappeared from sight. The Tower of Babel. Rubiconte's statuesque, staggering form stepped forth from the dying light of the crystal, his opaque gaze cutting through edge as an explosion of flames discharged behind him, giving him the appearance of a majestic phoenix spreading its wings. His lengthy, slender legs, normally impeccable in the grace in which they carried their master, were bowing as if he had been recently injured, swaying crookedly with each broken step. The cowl wrapped around his charred, leathery face was slashed to ribbons, revealing a blackened mouth with bloodied, split lips and missing teeth. The turban set upon his head, normally a crown of effervescent flame, was a dying collective of blue and purple flames that clung to the deformed keratin horns sprouting from his skull.
Erg.
The fiend growled, disoriented, as if he had just finally now noticed Edge among the chaos of the burning room.
I am Ruby Kent. We're well past introductions at this point,
Edge sneered up at him, withdrawing Masamune and Murasame from the holster on his back and shifting into position.
You've been haunting me ever since this moon decided to pay us a visit. I want to know what this all means, once and for all. Surely you weren't just pining for the good old days, right?
But Ruby Kent didn't seem to hear him, or if he did, he was pointedly ignoring every word. Instead, he threw open his cloak, unleashing a cyclone of fire that came rushing at Edge like a bat out of hell. Edge leapt out of the way, his feet scheming the spinning flames as he took advantage of the air current to give his jump more lift, somersaulting behind Ruby Kent and thrusting his blades into the twisted curve of his back.
God. Ah.
Ruby Kent howled, swinging around wildly as his bloodied fingernails clawed over his shoulders. Edge clung to the embedded handles of his katanas for dear life, having not expected Ruby Kent to have such fight in him after being duly impaled. As Ruby Kent ceased and staggered about, Edge swung his legs forward, planting his boots into Rubiconte's backside and using his body as leverage to execute a backflip and simultaneously withdraw the katanas. He didn't want Ruby Kent to be able to reach back and get his hands on one. Twin streams of blood erupted from the gouges left by the blades, sending Ruby Kent into another rage as he spun to face Edge, the hateful scowl on his face clashing with dead, lifeless eyes.
What are you doing? What am I doing?
Edge blinked, lowering the katana slightly.
What's wrong with you? No.
Ruby Kent howled, digging his claws into his turban as another gathering of infernos assembled in the corners of the crystal chamber, churning their way toward the crystal daises where Ruby Kent and Edge were sparring. Edge twisted around despondently, cursing under his breath when he realized there would be no easy escape this time around. He tried firing off a flood ninjutsu technique, thinking that if he managed to divert Ruby Kante's attention that he would not be able to hold sway over his inferno spell, but even in the throes of his convulsions, Ruby Kent managed to drape his cloak over his body, the waves of water absorbing harmlessly into the mystic fibers of the garment and infusing Ruby Kent with a fresh surge of energy. Edge cursed much louder now, half hoping that at least Ruby Kent would give him one of his snide, hoity-toity lectures about honor and how men should conduct themselves in battle, but he was met only with the increasing roar of the oncoming flames. This is insane, Edge thought, spying a slender pilaster to his left that he hoped he could scale to temporarily evade the rampaging magic that was about to eat him alive. He dashed across the chamber, taking a running leap up the side of the wall and throwing himself to the closest ledge he could grab, barely only a few inches in width for him to grip, and proceeded to drag his way up. He didn't dare look down to check on Ruby Kent, even though he could hear the autarch's shrieks as easily as if he were right beside him. Each one sent a shiver up his spine and made his palms break out in a fresh round of perspiration on the already slippery glass. Why is Ruby Kent here if he's not going to put any effort into fighting me? The scorched automaton bodies in the other room, the interference in the portal that was supposed to teleport us out. You're sending me mixed signals here, Rube, I don't like it. Edge winced as the fire from an encroaching twister licked at the back of his legs, shooting pain running up his nerve endings. Faster. I have get higher, or else. It was at that moment that Ruby Kent lifted his head from his fit, spotting Edge attempting to flee his spell like the cowardly insect he was. The confusing rage that filled his cells was so immense that he nearly spontaneously combusted right then and there. The gray haze that permeated his sight gave way to carmine salience, and before he could comprehend what he was doing, extended a claw toward Edge and silently cast a stop spell. The spell smashed effortlessly into Edge's backside, the petrifying chill of hundreds of crackling electrons taking hold of his limbs as the dizzying chaos surrounding him suddenly seemed to speed up 100-fold. It was only when his fingers refused to obey his brain's command to curl over the newest ledge he had reached that he realized what had happened. The world around him wasn't hastening, he was coming to a grinding halt.
SH.
He could not complete his attempt at vulgarity before his mouth suspended mid-sentence, his eyes frozen in wide-open shock as his body fell backward from the wall and directly into the wind tunnel generated by one of the Inferno spells. The blast of turbulent firestorm filled his ears as he felt the familiar sensation of boiling blood just beneath the surface of his flesh. This was the same trap he had fallen into at Evelyn with Rydia when Ruby Kent had invaded his dream state. In seconds, his stamina would be absorbed by the storm, leaving him a spent husk. Next, the maelstrom would then turn that same energy it had drained against him, transforming his body into a sacrificial pyre at the foot of Ruby Kante's altar. It was a trap, Edge conceded, his vision a blur of bleeding reds and oranges as he felt himself sinking deeper into the eye of the storm. Smoke and ash had begun to fill his stalled lungs, and he could feel the back of his eyes tearing, desperate to find any kind of relief in the searing heat, but his body refused to yield to time and let the tears flow. The real Ruby Kent would never play so dirty. This is that witch is doing, somehow. My parents warned me about what this moon would show me. And still, I walked right into that frightful girl's clutches. But I just wanted to protect all of you. From this wretched moon. From enemies cast across the universe. From a broken future. Maybe from myself, too. Out of the corner of his eye as he was spun adrift in the storm, Edge saw a familiar scintillating pillar erupt over one of the daises, the same crystalline light that had filled the room when his parents' crystals had emerged, except this time, instead of a pulsating twilight, it was stained a rich iridium that spilled over the dais like the promise of springtime. A portal burst open in the ceiling above, a strange, silk-like object floating from the opening and drifting over the empty dais. As he dizzily spun around, his vision failing him further with each revolution, Edge thought that perhaps it was some sort of feather? Or maybe a ribbon. Did that mean someone else was here? Even so, Edge knew it was too late for him now. He closed his eyes, reveling in light's gentle embrace over his withering flesh. That light. It may be one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I wish I could show you, Rydia. Whenever I see green, I see a vision of life. I see you. Did I ever tell you that? Maybe I should have before everything went so wrong. As the last trace of oxygen left Edge's lips, the long-awaited curtain of darkness finally began to descend when a massive explosion suddenly rocked his body, jolting all of his senses back to life as a rush of emerald gales blew away Rubiconte's storm and wrapped around Edge, carrying him to the shattered dais where the detonation had gone off and gently depositing him into a mix of shattered marble and crystal dust. Immediately keeling over and releasing a series of painful, but also oh so wonderful coughs, Edge greedily drank in gulps of clean air and marveled at the sensation of having control over his own body once more as he flexed his fingers against the debris beneath. His cloak and his cowl had been nearly burned all the way through, leaving only tatters, but he was otherwise in fair condition. The bruises and burns he had acquired were nothing a little Kurija couldn't fix, if he ever saw Rosa or Porum again, that was. Rubicant was staring at him from the base of the crumbled dais, his mouth a bloodied slash as he sank to his knees and clutched at his head, releasing yet another devastating wail. Sinking into the floor, he lifted his chin with such an effort that one would think his head weighed 1,000 pounds, his eyes desperately searching Edge's as the grey mist within mixed with the brilliant verdant that had spilled forth from the dais and was burned away to reveal the malachite gaze that Edge knew was the autarch's true visage. He would never forget for the rest of his life, or even in death, the way those eyes had pierced him through and through the night he had first encountered Rubicant in the cave of Eblin. So long ago, when my rage blinded me, it was my friends that were able to bring the light back to my eyes. Cecil, Rydia, Rosa, even you, Cain. You traitorous bastard. And now? Rubicant clawed at the floor as he spat his next words, his back hunching dangerously.
Strike me down. Now.
Edge fell back, startled, wondering if part of his brain had ended up getting fried after all.
What are you? Hurry.
He hissed, letting out another howl as he dug his fingers into his skull.
I can't keep control much longer.
This is the real Rubicant, Edge frowned, his body rising on its own like clockwork as he drifted forward, deviating from his objective only momentarily to swoop down and retrieve Mass Immune from the floor, where it had been miraculously deposited, unharmed, by the inferno. When he reached Rubiconte's trembling form, he lifted the blade to his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he aimed the tip of the katana for Rubiconte's heart.
Yes. That's right.
The fiend gurgled, his eyes alit with brilliance even as his body contorted with such a ferocity that it looked as if there was a demon clawing at him from the inside, working to tear his flesh asunder so that it could finally find release. Edge faltered, the blade slipping in his hands as he swallowed what felt like a mouthful of sand. Rubicant? You look as if you're in agony? But before Edge could change his mind, he forced himself to lunge forward, cleanly driving the blade through Rubiconte's chest and pulling back in one quick motion, the blade dripping with putrid black blood as the fresh wound bubbled and spilled the fiend's essence in an ebony waterfall across his scarred abdomen. Rubicant glanced down at the fatal blow with a small smile on his face, gingerly running his fingertips over the spill with quiet delight.
Heh. So, you really did find it. Your true strength. I knew the moment I saw that light that you had at last found your way. Even in my addled state. My friends are my light,
Edge said softly.
Crystals can be fabricated, and stars will burn out. But the light of my friends will live on in my heart long beyond the day I die.
Rubicant chuckled, a spray of blood escaping his lips.
Yes. And that is why you must stop it. Stop this moon. With all your might.
Edge lowered his blade, turning his back just as Rubicant collapsed to the floor in a heap, his flesh dissolving into crystal dust that drifted into the air and faded away. The Archfiends. They're all as much a part of the world as we are. What kind of terror are we facing that would upend their souls from hell just to force us to fight once more? Edge shook his head slightly at the absurdity his life had become in such a short time, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. I hate to say it, but if you had been fighting as your true self, You would still be out of my league, Ruby Kent. I'll accept this victory for what it was. For now. He heard the gentle swish of silk rustle past his ears, and suddenly felt the weight of something powerfully warm drape over his shoulders like molten steel pouring into a mold. Peering over his shoulder and spinning in a semicircle, he saw that Rubiconte's massive cloak of flame had been swathed over him, the tattered ends dragging across the floor from which Rubiconte's body had completely disappeared and had been replaced by another portal, this one much more accessible than the one hanging suspended above the now destroyed dais. Blinking in confusion, Edge yanked on a portion of the fabric and brought it closer to inspect it. He was awed at the sight of the cloak up close. Woven alongside the silk were flecks of crystalline fibers that he could only imagine were what was responsible for the magic of Rubiconte's cape, being able to absorb any element known to man. A crystal brooch was sewn into the front folds of the collar to fasten it shut, shining with all the luminosity of the crystal of fire formerly of Damsion. You too, were once filled with dreams for our planet. Probably nothing that you or I would ever see eye to eye on, but there must have something that drove you, a spirit as ancient as our world itself, to join Golbez's cause once upon a time. Whatever your hopes may have been, then, I can at least do you the honor of granting your final wish. I will stop this moon, no matter what it takes. And I will destroy anyone that gets in my way. He sheathed Masamune, deciding that it would be wise to also find Murasame before he went back to fetch the others. After a few minutes of searching the empty chamber, he realized that his other sword had been dropped along with him back on the crumbled dais when he saw the familiar leather-wrapped hilt sticking out of a pile of debris. As he scaled the mess, he saw a flash of very familiar green draped over a slab of unblemished white marble, realizing it was the mysterious treasure that had drifted from what Edge was beginning to think of as the defective portal from above. Kneeling down to take a closer look, he felt the blood rush to his cheeks as another flashback to Evelyn Castle flooded his mind. It was when he had awoken from the nightmare in which Ruby Kent had so generously invaded, expecting to be burned to a crisp and half-mauled by Ifrit. But instead, he had awoken to restored health and the scent of hyacinths, a spill of glossy emerald waves blanketing his chest as Rydia slept peacefully by his side.
Rydia!
He whispered out loud, gingerly lifting the emerald curl and holding it before him in the light. Other than being rather bluntly sliced across one end, there seemed to be nothing else suspicious about the tress. It was still perfumed with the scent of hyacinth, with perhaps a mixture of fresh rain, not that he understood how that could be possible on a dead moon like this. It was you. You saved me from myself. Yet again. That must mean you're somewhere close. Right? He gazed up at the portal above, blinking in surprise as it suddenly collapsed in on itself as if to say, "Nice try." The chamber ceiling going back to being absolutely nothing of any use to anyone. Edge couldn't help but chuckle and gave a shrug. You probably got tired of waiting for me, hey? Guess I'm going to have to add another apology to the list when we finally see each other again. He smiled to himself, tucking the lock of hair in the fastener of the cloak and rising to his feet. But this time around, it's not just going to be apologies. I'm not gonna wait another 17 years to say what needs to be said. So please, just wait for me a little longer. I'll be there soon. Harley grimaced as another painful rock stabbed through the sole of her boot, the sound of crunching pausing along with her as she lifted her leg to yank at the offending gravel and toss it. It sailed over the ledge that was no more than 5 feet away, tumbling into a spill of twisted space that was a blend of midnight and violet, punctuated with piercing blue light of distant stars. She held still, her hand clasped around her ankle as she waited to hear the rock reach its final resting place, but after a few moments, she realized that was never going to happen, and set her foot down on the dirt-streaked crystal walkway with an involuntary shiver. She still hadn't been brave enough to bring herself to actually look over the ledges that seemed to surround them no matter how far they journeyed. Their path, so far, had been straight and to the point, little room for deviation unless one felt like a bit of skydiving. She supposed now that if she did dare to take a peek over a ledge, she wouldn't actually see anything but the bottomless depths of space, anyway. No big deal. Behind her, Edward was kneeling next to a massive red fern that was blooming out of a cluster of chipped crystals and a crumbling pillar, gingerly running his fingers over its leaves and muttering to himself. She could just barely hear a snatch of his observations as he stood back up, the fern springing back into place.
How could something like this be growing here?
Harley didn't reply. She knew enough from her voracious studies that like most other plants, ferns survived on photosynthesis, and unlike most other plants, they were hundreds of millions of years old, and the only land plant to have two forms during the reproductive stage. No facts that were exactly helpful to them here, although she did consider herself quite the riot at parties. After they had teleported out of the Tower of Zot, they had been dropped this cold, nearly lightless wasteland that neither of them recognized from any place they had ever been before. At first, both Harley and Edward had thought they had entered some type of underground trail. They could feel dirt and rocks grinding beneath their feet as they wandered, and the air was dry and stale, like it had been sealed away from the rest of the world for the gods knew how long. But the more their eyes got used to the lack of light, the more that was slowly revealed to them about their new locale. As alone as they thought they were actually surrounded by hundreds of plants, many petrified and encased in greenish-gray calcium, some still managing to survive against all odds, like the ferns, and the remainder smashed and trampled in the dust-ridden pathway they had stumbled upon that appeared to only go in one direction, due south. Some of the plant life was so ancient that it had become embedded in the crystalline road itself. Even after crawling on her hands and knees to inspect it, Harley couldn't tell if the crystal had somehow grown over the greenery on the path, or if it had always been there and some sort of ungodly pressure had crushed them together. Considering they were surrounded by the swells of what appeared to be outer space itself, Harley decided it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that a powerful distortion could have warped a place like this in the blink of an eye.
It's almost like a human-sized open terrarium,
Harley mused.
I feel like a giant hand could find its way inside here any moment and pluck one of us off the ground. That's one of your more disturbing observations, I must say,
Edward frowned.
But it does seem like people once lived here, doesn't it? The scattered piles of rubble could have been houses.
Harley nodded, pressing her fingers to her chin.
Would they have evolved to no longer need the sun or water? A fascinating concept, indeed.
Edward turned away, lowering his gaze as he lifted a sprig of whisperweed from his vest. The entire time they had been here, it had not gone off once. Perhaps it had been too much to hope that they would have been reunited with Palom, Forum, and Leonora, but at least when they had been in the separate towers, they had still been able to speak. Now, he had no idea if the silence on the other line meant that something terrible had happened to them on Mount Ordeals, or if he and Harley had been transported so far away that they were now utterly beyond anyone's reach. Both options were horrifying concepts, though Edward decided that if this were the place where he was to die, he could at least be grateful that it would be Harley, of all the people in the world, that would be with him until the very end. Silver linings, and all that. They continued onward, reaching a short flight of stairs that made a loud clang as they stepped down. It was so unsettling compared to the relative silence that accompanied their trek through soil and stone that it made both of them nearly leap out of their skin.
This sounds like steel.
Harley gasped, stomping her foot down once more for good measure and sending another loud clanking noise rippling throughout the dead air. Edward was about to politely ask her to perhaps not be so vigorous with her noisemaking when another loud crash rang out, and a blink and new Mississippiate flash of light briefly illuminated the plain, reminding Edward of an abandoned cemetery on a stormy night. Harley and Edward turned to face each other, their eyes reflecting each other's terror, and they wordlessly fled down the remainder of the stairs, hurrying toward another decaying pillar that was big enough to hide the two of them if they kept close. Pressing their backs to one another, Harley took the left lookout, while Edward took the right, both hardly daring to breathe. Harley silently prayed that if an enemy encroached that it might not approach her side. She could barely see a thing without her glasses, which were now crushed into a twist of metal stashed away in her pocket thanks to Barbaricia. Crick. Crick. Crunch. Oh gods. Harley gulped, pressing harder against Edward as she tried to suck in her gut and make herself as skinny as possible behind the column. She heard the breath catch in his throat behind her, and a few moments later, felt his fingers snake through her own. His palms were damp with sweat that she could feel even through her gloves, although she didn't know if the unsettling shaking she could also feel was coming from him or her. Clang. 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 They were on the stairs, now, definitely more than one of them, by the sounds of it, and tromping around with the strength that she could only imagine a large monster carried. Harley squeezed her eyes shut, no longer able to bear the strain of trying to make out whatever was coming after them in the darkness with her diminished vision. If the enemy approached on her side, they would be as good as dead anyway. She foolishly realized that Barbaricia's whip was still tucked away inside her jacket on the side against the pillar. She'd never be able to reach it in time. As the footsteps edged closer to their hiding place, Edward slid his hand toward his belt, quietly unfastening the knife held within and pressing it to his hip. His lack of skill and peripheral disadvantage might not be enough to slay any of their would-be attackers, but he figured at the very least that he could provide a middling enough distraction for Harley to run for it. The portal that had deposited them in this awful place had disappeared as soon as they had stepped away, but perhaps there was another one waiting for them at the end of the path that would take her far away enough to manage an escape. He felt the shadow fall over him before he saw it, drowning him in yet more darkness when the meager starlight blazing in the skies above was completely snuffed out. He felt his body and his mental faculties shift into autopilot as he lifted his hand with the knife, a strangled cry for Harley to run escaping his throat before he brought the blade down on their assailant. End of chapter.